Hello and welcome to Dateline London. For the third time in just over 20 years, the United Kingdom finds itself engaged in military action in Iraq. We're going to devote the programme today to one simple question. When it comes to interventions in predominantly Muslim countries, do Western governments actually know what they're doing? And even if they do know what they're doing and trying to achieve, is it achievable? My guests today are Nabila Ramdani, who's a French-Algerian writer and broadcaster, Nazanin Ansari from Iran's Kayhan, Polly Toynbee from The Guardian, and Striker Maguire from Bloomberg Markets. Very good to see you. Nabila, I mean, that big question, do you think that given the brutality of Islamic State, as they call themselves, that it is necessary to engage in some kind of action and that the West is right in doing so?
Well, you're asking about, the legacy of Western intervention in the Muslim world. I mean, the straightforward answer to your question is no. The West hardly knows what it's doing when it attacks Muslim countries. Just look at the muddled record of the West in countries such as Afghanistan or indeed Iraq. I spent time reporting from Libya as well, where before mainly British and French airstrikes blasted Colonel Gaddafi's regimes to pieces. French and British jets decided to speed up a revolution, to take sides in the civil war and to bring about regime change. And look at the country is now in the hands of Islamic extremists, every bit as murderous and undemocratic as Gaddafi. So Western military force in the Middle East and North Africa has time and time again proved to be a failure. And there's a very strong argument that the self-styled Islamic State, IS, is a direct result of the illegal Iraq war. And the view that violence produces more violence certainly holds up in all these cases. So yes, airstrikes can go on indefinitely, as they did in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. The war went on for a very long time. But this idea that IS will disappear just overnight is absolutely nonsense, frankly.
What do you make of the argument which was made by the British government yesterday, which is because there were mistakes in the past, does not mean that you shouldn't act now, because IS are particularly abhorrent, and they're abhorrent across the Muslim world as well?
Well, I think the main difference with this intervention is that IS is a well-defined group, if you like. There's no ambiguity. There's not much ambiguity about them. They present a clear and present danger to everyone, whatever your race, your creed, your color, or indeed your political belief. They are a very well-defined evil enemy, and there's a widespread belief that they should be destroyed as such. But what this intervention highlights is and the way it's been brought about is not only the typical muddled way of Western meddling, if you like, in the Arab world, but also its inconsistency. It's very commendable to take an ethical stance, to try to destroy IS, but we haven't seen this stance reflected when it came to the killing of Palestinians by the thousands over the summer by Israel. So the best that the West can achieve in relation to IS is perhaps to destroy its capabilities and to try to cut off its funding.
Striker, I think those arguments, although not ultimately accepted by the White House, have played a part in the calculations and the fact that Obama took quite a long time to come to a decision in the first place, haven't they? And in other words, people do understand the downside of this, and it has not gone well. There's not a single action in a Muslim country in the 21st century that people can point to as an untrammeled success.
No, and Obama certainly knows that. You can understand, I can see how we've come to this point. I can see how we arrived to where we are today, but it's just virtually impossible to see how it's not going to turn out badly in some way. I mean, I think you can prevent some things from happening. I think you can protect some people, but you certainly can't destroy probably ISIS. You definitely cannot destroy jihadism, and you probably can make it worse. That's what's happened every single time. It isn't like this happened, like the last time we did this, it was in the 19th century. This was just a few years ago. And then it was the decade before that.
But you can see, I mean, again, implicit in what you were saying is protecting the Yazidis in as far as anybody can was a good thing, was it not? I mean, I think everybody would agree.
I
protecting
think
people
most,
from
yes, I think
a genocide.
I think there are probably maybe some people who felt that there should be no intervention, humanitarian or of any kind ever. There are some people who believe that. But yes, I can see why you would want to protect, you know, a group of people that, you know, who are about to be destroyed. I can also see how the beheadings would, you know, inflame opinion, which basically, you know, in this country and in the United States, kind of opened a window. It's like a window of opportunity. Okay, now we actually can justify doing something because people are so appalled by what's going on.
But where do you think the Iranian government is in this, and what's the role of the Revolutionary Guards in Iraq?
Well, certainly after 10 years and spending over $1 trillion, there has been an abysmal failure in Iraq. And one of the reasons that there has been a failure has been because the United States policy has been to concentrate leadership within the Shia community without having a real proper good governance, without having to have participatory real democracy. And that is where what is happening in Iraq is a reflection of the policies that have been taking place in Iran as well. But at the same time, Iran is the white turban in the room, is being brought in from the cold. And certainly, if there is one power, one country that knows how to deal with ISIS through violence and all of that, is the Iranian regime. And certainly there has been a de facto cooperation between the United States and the Iranian forces on the ground, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps in Iraq, through either the Iraqi government or through certain other parties. But at the same time, let's not forget the problem of Iraq has been the lack of proper governance. And even now, when we think about ISIS, let's see what is ISIS made of. There's a very good report that was published by the Conservative Middle East Council, Kwasi Kwarteng, and Leo Doherty, who had visited Iraq in September. And basically what it says is that, first of all, ISIS is made up of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good are the tribal leaders, the Sunnis. The bad are the hardcore jihadists. And they're the ones that we see most of the time on TV. And the ugly are the Baathists and the disenfranchised elements of the previous Saddam Hussein's army. So the three of them together have made this monster. And how do you deal with it? It is, I think, one of the most important things that I think the United States, the British, the 60 countries that are coming together have to do is what kind of a vision do they have for after this?
That's a very good question. Because
what political governance?
Because we have been visionless in a sense. I mean, the idea in 2003 that American and British soldiers were going to be welcomed with people bearing roses and there was going to be a thriving democracy in Iraq didn't look very solid at the time, and it looks ludicrous now.
It makes you weep to look back at what was said then. You know, the beacon of democracy that will shine a light across the whole of the Middle East, and everything will come right because Iraq will be this great pro-Western gem of Western-style democracy. What insanity. Well, lots of people thought so at the time, not as if everybody was taken in. I don't think, when you look at the debate in the House of Commons in Britain yesterday, I don't think you've ever seen a country more reluctant to go to war, and yet almost universally, with a very heavy heart, agreeing to a very minimalist act. You know, 6 planes, a token, a gesture to say, we're with you, America, but only in Iraq, only with the limited, perhaps, objection of trying to support the government which has called us in, which now looks slightly more inclusive than the previous one. Can we protect them from ISIS actually taking over? Probably can't reclaim any ground that ISIS has got, but you might at least be able to stop them in their tracks from taking over Baghdad or committing genocide on other groups of people around Erbil and some of those other places. Perhaps you can just contain them there. That's a reasonable objective, but how long for? What's the exit strategy? Are you there forever? 6 planes is not serious in Britain's part. We don't feel serious either. The reason we're there, oddly enough, is partly because of Ukraine. Everything is connected. If we need the Americans to stay as the defenders of Europe, which they've always been, Europe very, very reluctant to spend money itself on defence, needing the Americans, Putin on the doorstep, you have to be realistic about your allies, and if they ask you to do something, and it's legal, and the government of that country asks you in, you sort of have to go.
It's political cover.
It's political cover. It's a gesture of friendship to an ally we need.
But I wanted to pick up the sectarian question, which is underlying some of this. And some people resent it when you say it like this, but surely, whatever the cover that's being given to the British by having, and the Americans by having some Sunni allied states, to many Sunni people, as opposed to their governments, this may look like an intervention on the side, because who does it benefit? It benefits Iran, an Iraqi government which is led by Shia, and potentially Bashar al-Assad and the Alawites. So in other words, is the West blundering into what is fundamentally a sectarian struggle?
Well, I think what the West is trying to achieve first and foremost, and especially America, is to make out that they have strong Arab allies, and it's not America going it alone again, or indeed the UK being their prime ally in this intervention. But I very much agree with Nazanin when she says that Iran has a prime role to play in all this, and he has been shunned so far because a Shia Iran would upset a Sunni Saudi Arabia as joining that coalition. And I think there's an awful lot of hypocrisy there to include countries like Saudi Arabia as the defender of democracy in Iraq. Let's not forget that Saudi Arabia was fueling the civil war. It was pouring millions of dollars into Al-Qaeda affiliated groups which have morphed into IS, and who are the reason why the West is now intervening. And the relationship between Saudi Arabia and its Western allies, compliant allies like Britain and Saudi Arabia, and Britain, is largely a pragmatic and an unprincipled one. The amount of Saudi Arabia's oil production can effectively buy them everything in terms of interest and influence. And we have a very lucrative, in Britain, trade partnership, a bilateral contract between Saudi Arabia and Britain, which is worth more than 15 billion pounds a year. And it mainly involves arms sales. So we must stop this inconsistency, and there I'd say it's rank hypocrisy, frankly.
But, at the same time, I think we are going to see a new Iraq emerging. I mean, at best, it would be a more federal Iraq. But certainly, I think, the Peshmergas in the Kurdish areas are not going to fight ISIS instead of the Iraqi military. The Iraqi military has just faded away.
Yeah, but you, as you said, rightly, after billions of dollars have been spent, has been spent on building up this force, and we've heard the same story being told in Afghanistan. We built up this force, it's all great, and then suddenly, faced with some very determined but small number of people, they melt away. They
melt away because their heart is not in it. And the heart of other defenders of Iraq is not in this central government. So what we are going to see, perhaps, would be division between the Shiite part, which is, the Shiites, the border between Iraq and Iran has been existent since 16th century. So when there was the Ottoman Empire, then you will have a Kurdish probably section there, country, and then also a Sunni-dominated area. But this all demands a thinking right now, strategic thinking, a political thinking.
Do you see any chance at all of Saudi Arabia and Iran coming to terms to say, listen, it's in both of our interests to stop this. All right, we'll forgive Saudi Arabia for having fueled this in the first place. Do you see any chance of that?
Certainly, there's moves being made between the two countries on, right now it's back channels and low level. But they are working, and certainly the United States and the European allies, they all want Iran and Saudi Arabia to come together because, and you pointed it out best, Ukraine is a problem. Russia is going to be a problem. and how to be able to maintain this world politics, world balance, when you have Russia in the Security Council becoming more and more of a headache to everybody.
Yeah.
Does anybody have a clue what success would look like in this? I mean, you know, ISIS are not going to fade away. They're presumably, as Polly suggested, they can be kept back, presumably. They can't strut around as they have been in the past. But to dismantle a guerrilla movement, effectively a guerrilla movement, from the air is just not going to happen. And if the Iraqi army is not up to the job, people don't want to invite the Iranians in, it's difficult to see how this is ever going to be resolved.
Well, I guess you could imagine, again, that there might be really short-term success. I mean, success over a period of weeks, maybe, where you actually have protected refugees or would-be refugees, and there's less violence and so forth. But when you see this situation, it's like you have all these, it's like the concentric circles of, you know, a tree. You know, it's
Or hell.
Or hell.
Or hell, yes.
Yeah, more like Dante's
Medieval
concentric
painting.
circle. It is like, I mean, you solve one problem. Let's say ISIS, you know, that small on the border with Syria and Iraq. Let's say somehow you manage to improve that. Then you still have the fact that the Kurds have taken new territory in the north of Iraq. You still have the fact that Turkey is worried about what's going to happen. What happens to Assad matters. The further you go out, the more, in a sense, the more kind of geopolitically weighty the problems become. So you have Ukraine, you have Russia, you have Iran, you have Saudi Arabia, and then you keep going out further and you have the UK and the US and you have Europe. I mean, I don't know, success would, it's virtually impossible to imagine what it would look like.
Well, indeed, but you know, after World War I, when all these borders were drawn, there was a great conference and it was flawed in Versailles, but the people came up with a plan. During World War II, people came up with a plan what the world would look like. At the end of the Cold War, it just kind of happened, and nobody came up with a plan for how Ukraine or Eastern Europe should look like. There has been no great conference. There's been no great conference about the future of the Middle East or the boundaries. Because, why? Because presumably people think it couldn't go anywhere.
I think people believed by the end of the Soviet empire that self-determination was it. Countries should be allowed to choose what they want. And it ignored all of that realpolitik, that in the end the big powers lean heavily on anybody who's weak. And they somehow pretended that democracy on its own would make all these places free. Well, you're never free if you're being lent on.
Especially since many of these countries are not United Nation states. They were cobbled together by outsiders.
And also, if I may add, one of the problems from 2003 onwards was the quantification of democracy. That is, what is democracy is one man, one vote, whereas democracy is more than numbers. Democracy is based on certain values and principles. Certainly, women's right is number one. And what happened in Iraq after 2003, all women, Iraqi women, doctors, professionals, they had to go back under the threat of veil and being sidelined in politics at home, elsewhere as well. So I think hopefully one of the lessons that they will learn from 2003 is that to involve civil society, to bring in women, to bring in different groups, different religions, and NGOs to see what is the vision that they want to have after ISIS is gone. And that is going to be a generational struggle, because without the participation of the Sunnis, nothing would happen. Ordinary Sunnis, it would be a defeat.
Nabila?
Yes, I think that although, you know, there's clearly a strong coalition that is determined to crush IS, I think the way the different countries go about doing it is different. For example, the French approach, it's very, you don't normally associate French left-wing governments with a hawkish approach to foreign policy or indeed with airstrikes. And I do believe that this global fight against radical Islam is in fact providing a great deal of relief to President Hollande, whose domestic approval rating is at 13%. The economy is in chaos, so, foreign adventures.
Mali.
Exactly. It always provides, suits, if you like, a struggling head of state. Yes, he has committed, he sent troops to two African countries, Mali and the Central African Republic, but I don't think that we'll see the same level of commitment in Iraq.
I don't think it's clear that Cameron will have gained out of this. I mean, he won't have lost because he's got the support of the other parties, so whatever happens, it's not really going to be his fault. But I don't think you can say that he's gone to war in that spirit of, I know what, this is what the Falklands did for Margaret Thatcher before the next election. I think there was a deep reluctance all round. So it would be unfair to say, really, Cameron was pleased. I think, like Obama, who desperately didn't want to get back into Iraq, I think there was a real sense, but there were conflicting sense. You know, we broke it, we ought to fix it. Well, do you fix it by breaking it a bit more?
Yeah.
It's a really
and they
difficult
also need
question.
to get their act together when it comes to paying ransoms, for example. It's an open secret that the French have been paying hundreds of millions of dollars in ransoms for hostages. Right up until a few months ago, 4 hostages were released in April. And these needs, you know, they need to coordinate all that.
Because British and Americans don't.
Do not,
But
yes.
We'd much rather have a fight with the French about something like that than actually tangle with the real problem.
The real problem on the
itself.
ground. Just pursue the question of domestic politics in the few minutes we've got left. I mean, if Cameron limited risk in the sense that they're all in it together, did Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, cover himself with glory this week? Because the way in which he parsed the problem about we're prepared to do a little bit in Iraq but not do anything in Syria, is that a kind of credible response from somebody who would aspire to be a Prime Minister of our country?
I think it is. I think there's absolutely no question that the House of Commons would be appalled at the idea we went into Syria without another vote. And then you'll look at the reason why then, if there is some overwhelming reason why we should. Syria is a very different question. You know, you have the Prime Minister, an elected government, asking you in, asking for your help. You have, 60 nations all together, and you're a small part of that, a small gesture of support. I think he was absolutely right to say keep this very limited. I don't get the feeling that Cameron, or some of the sort of nutcases in Cameron's party, say we must go straight into Syria as well. But mostly, I think everybody has this feeling of there is no exit strategy. There is no victory here. There is no point at which you say, finally we've done it, whatever it is. And everybody's very aware of this. At least this time, people are realistic about what they're getting into.
Yes, but I think that more than that, he came across as a bit wishy-washy with no conviction. And I think one of the most difficult decisions that a politician has to make is whether or not to take his country to war. And I wouldn't trust Ed Miliband to make that decision, to be honest. I don't think he looks like a commander-in-chief in the wings. Quite the opposite. He doesn't have a military gait. And, he comes across as a very intelligent and affable chap. But it stops there, I don't
I
think.
don't think PR man Cameron has exactly got a military background either.
But
I think the thing about Miliband is that he was dead right about going to Syria last year. It would have been a really bad mistake, and he succeeded in a man in opposition, a leader of a rather weak opposition, succeeded in stopping the President of the United States going into Syria precipitately, too soon, not the right time. Who are we supporting in Syria? We have no idea.
Looking back at that was the right decision.
That was the right decision. It might yet be the right decision to go in there, but you've got to know whose side you're on. Whose side are we on in Syria? What are we doing there?
There's
At least we've got a side to be on in
I think
Iraq.
there's a broader point to all of this, which is the fact that whoever's Prime Minister of this country is dealing with a changing power. This is a shrinking power. I mean, the U.S. is also a shrinking power, but it's still a superpower.
It's got more than 6 tornadoes
but this,
of aircraft carriers with aircraft.
This country's getting smaller geopolitically, and it can do less and less. And therefore, any prime minister has to figure out what is our foreign policy. So far, it seems to have 3 strands: a humanitarian strand, which is quite consistent and strong and good. The second strand is to protect UK business interests and foment commerce, etc. And the third has been essentially to do what the US does, except that then it became, we're never going to do what the US does again, except that now we are doing what the US does again. So, this country is going through a bit of a sort of shifting situation.
It was ever thus. We haven't had a foreign policy that makes any sense since the war.
Yeah.
Just in the minute we've got left, do you think that effectively there has to be an Arab solution to what is fundamentally an Arab problem?
Yes, very much so.
And that's where it will be sorted out,
I think
or
we
not.
should be putting more trust and indeed give more responsibility to the neighbours of Iraq.
Including Turkey, which is obviously
Including
not
Turkey,
an Islam.
and Iran is not
And Iran
Arab.
is not an Arab state. I was directing it to Nabila. I'm well aware that the Iranians are not Arab. But you think that that is...
Iran has capability. Turkey is part of NATO. The UAE, I was in the UAE last week, and there is a strong determination to prove to the world that IS has nothing to do with Islam. It is totally un-Islamic, and they want to show that it doesn't represent their culture, their values, lets them act on it.
And I think it is time for those countries who call themselves Islamic, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, to actually start treating their citizens much better, like the women, the Baha'is, the Sufis. They have to set an example on how to behave.
OK, on that happy note, thank you very much. That's it for Dateline London for this week. We're back next week at the same time. You can comment on the programme on Twitter @GavinEssler. Thank you for watching and goodbye.